Breaking news is coming in from the Middle East, where the United States has carried out fresh military strikes against ISIS targets inside Syria. This development has immediately drawn global attention because it touches on security, regional stability, and the long-running fight against extremist groups that continue to threaten both local populations and international interests. According to initial reports, the U.S. strikes were aimed at known ISIS positions operating in remote and contested areas of Syria. These areas have long been used by ISIS cells as hiding places, training grounds, and logistical hubs. Even after the group lost most of its territorial control, it has continued to function as an insurgent force, carrying out ambushes, bombings, and assassinations. The U.S. military has stated that the purpose of these strikes was to disrupt ISIS operations and prevent future attacks. Officials emphasized that the action was defensive in nature and designed to protect American personnel, coalition partners, and regional allies. This suggests that intelligence indicated an imminent or growing threat from ISIS elements in the region. ISIS, also known as Daesh, emerged from the chaos of the Iraq War and the Syrian Civil War. At its peak, the group controlled large areas of territory and declared a so-called caliphate. Although that territorial control was dismantled by U.S.-led coalition forces, the ideology and network behind ISIS did not disappear. In Syria, the situation remains extremely complex. Multiple actors operate within the same geographic space, including the Syrian government, Russian forces, Iranian-backed militias, Kurdish-led forces, Turkish troops, and various opposition groups. Within this crowded battlefield, ISIS has managed to survive by adapting its tactics and keeping a low profile. The latest U.S. strikes highlight the reality that ISIS is still considered a serious threat. Despite years of military pressure, the group has not been completely eliminated. Instead, it has shifted toward guerrilla warfare, using small cells to strike unexpectedly and then fade back into the desert or mountainous terrain. U.S. officials often stress that allowing ISIS to regroup would be a major security risk. Past experience has shown that even small, seemingly weakened extremist groups can quickly rebuild if left unchecked. This is one of the main reasons the U.S. maintains a military presence and conducts periodic strikes in Syria. Another important aspect of this development is timing. The strikes come amid broader regional tensions, including instability in Iraq, ongoing conflict in Gaza, and heightened friction involving Iran and its allies. In such an environment, any military action can have ripple effects far beyond its immediate target. The U.S. has made it clear that its mission in Syria is not aimed at overthrowing the Syrian government, but at combating ISIS. However, the Syrian government has repeatedly condemned U.S. operations on its territory, calling them a violation of sovereignty. Damascus argues that it should be responsible for security within its own borders. Russia and Iran, both key allies of the Syrian government, have also criticized U.S. military actions in Syria. They claim that foreign intervention without the consent of the Syrian state undermines international law. At the same time, they too oppose ISIS and have conducted their own operations against extremist groups. This creates a paradoxical situation where multiple rival powers are fighting the same enemy but do not coordinate with each other. The lack of coordination increases the risk of misunderstandings or accidental clashes, especially in areas where forces operate close to one another. From the U.S. perspective, the strikes are part of an ongoing counterterrorism campaign. American leaders argue that waiting for ISIS to strike first would be irresponsible. They believe that preemptive action based on intelligence is necessary to keep the group off balance and reduce its ability to plan large-scale attacks. For local civilians, the situation is far more complicated and often tragic. Years of conflict have devastated Syrian infrastructure and displaced millions of people. Any military action, even when targeted, raises fears of civilian casualties and further instability. The U.S. military typically states that it takes extensive measures to minimize civilian harm. Precision, guided munitions, and careful target selection are emphasized. However, in a conflict zone like Syria, where fighters often blend into civilian areas, the risk can never be completely eliminated. Another key issue is the fate of ISIS prisoners. Thousands of suspected ISIS fighters and their family members are held in detention camps in northeastern Syria, guarded mainly by Kurdish-led forces. These camps have been described as overcrowded and unstable, raising concerns about potential escapes or radicalization. U.S. officials have warned that if these detention facilities collapse, ISIS could experience a resurgence. This is another reason the U.S. remains engaged in Syria, supporting local partners who are tasked with maintaining security on the ground. The strikes also send a message beyond Syria. They signal to extremist groups worldwide that the U.S. remains committed to counterterrorism operations, even as global attention shifts to other crises. This messaging is intended to deter potential attackers and reassure allies. Domestically, U.S. military actions abroad often spark debate. Supporters argue that targeted strikes are necessary to prevent terrorism and protect national security. Critics question the legal basis, long-term strategy, and human cost of continued military involvement in the Middle East. The legal justification for U.S. operations in Syria is based largely on the fight against ISIS and authorizations passed after the 9/11 attacks. Some lawmakers and analysts argue that these authorizations are outdated and need to be revisited to reflect current realities. Public opinion in the U.S. is also divided. After decades of war in the region, many Americans are weary of foreign conflicts. At the same time, there is widespread concern about the threat posed by extremist groups and the consequences of inaction. Regionally, U.S. strikes against ISIS are often welcomed quietly by some governments, even if they criticize them publicly. Many countries fear the spread of extremist violence and see U.S. military power as a stabilizing force, despite political disagreements. In Iraq, where ISIS also remains active, authorities closely monitor developments in neighboring Syria. The porous border between the two countries has historically allowed fighters and weapons to move back and forth. Instability on one side often affects the other. The Syrian conflict itself remains unresolved. Political negotiations have stalled, reconstruction is minimal, and sanctions continue to strain the economy. In such an environment, extremist groups find opportunities to exploit grievances and power vacuums. ISIS propaganda has long relied on portraying itself as resilient and unstoppable. Each time it survives a major military blow, it tries to use that survival as proof of its narrative. U.S. strikes aim to undermine this image by demonstrating that the group is constantly under pressure. However, military force alone is widely seen as insufficient to defeat ISIS permanently. Experts argue that addressing the underlying causes of extremism, such as political exclusion, economic hardship, and social fragmentation, is essential for long-term stability. Education, economic development, and inclusive governance are often mentioned as key factors in preventing radicalization. Without these, military victories risk being temporary, with extremist groups re-emerging in new forms. The situation in Syria illustrates this challenge clearly. After more than a decade of war, many communities are traumatized and impoverished. Young people growing up in such conditions may be more vulnerable to recruitment by extremist groups. International cooperation is another critical element. While the U.S. leads the coalition against ISIS, long-term success depends on coordination among regional and global powers. Political rivalries and conflicting interests have often undermined such cooperation. The latest strikes may also influence diplomatic calculations. Some actors may see them as a sign that the U.S. intends to maintain its role in Syria for the foreseeable future. Others may interpret them as limited actions rather than a broader strategic shift. Media coverage of these events varies widely. Some outlets focus on the military details, while others emphasize the political and humanitarian implications. How these strikes are perceived can shape public opinion and policy debates. For families affected by years of violence, each new round of fighting brings renewed anxiety. Even when ISIS is the target, civilians often fear being caught in the middle of larger power struggles beyond their control. As the story continues to develop, more details are likely to emerge about the scale of the strikes, the targets hit, and their impact on ISIS capabilities. Official statements may be followed by independent assessments and reactions from regional players. What remains clear is that the fight against ISIS is not over. Despite losing its so-called caliphate, the group continues to pose a threat that demands constant attention from security forces and policymakers. The U.S. strikes in Syria are a reminder that counterterrorism operations are ongoing, complex, and deeply intertwined with broader regional dynamics. Each action taken today can have consequences that unfold over months or even years. In the coming days, analysts will closely watch for any retaliation by ISIS or changes in its operational patterns. They will also look for diplomatic responses from Syria, its allies, and other international actors. Ultimately, this breaking news underscores a sobering reality. Even as the world faces new crises and shifting priorities, unresolved conflicts and extremist threats persist, requiring careful, informed, and often difficult decisions. As more information becomes available, understanding the broader context will be essential. The U.S. strikes against ISIS in Syria are not an isolated event, but part of a long and ongoing struggle that continues to shape the future of the region and global security.